I just want to welcome everybody, say Happy New Year. This is the first WIT event that we have in 2022. As people come in, please put your name and where you're viewing from and participating from in the chat. We want these talks to be very informal, fun, immersive. So please do write in the chat box who you are, where you're joining us from, and we know that we leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. My colleague Nikki will call on you if you raise your real hand or the little cartoon hand and take your question. But during the talk, please do share your comments and thoughts in the running commentary, because we want these to be as participatory as possible in these times of Zoom, when we can't all be together and creating community. So again, welcome to all of you who have come. This is our Words, Ideas, and Thinkers series, where we explore interesting and important ideas of the day. And today we'll be talking about writers and writing of the South. I am Lynn Bolger. I am the Executive Director of the Authors Guild Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Authors Guild, America's oldest and largest professional organization for writers and of all genres and kinds. And one of the questions that I'm often asked is, well, what does the Authors Guild do? And I start talking about educational programming and fighting piracy and fighting for copyright, protecting copyright, and eyes start to glaze over. But here's a great example of a recent huge win for the Authors Guild. Maybe you read about it in the newspaper. There was a news story last week about a Ukrainian e-piracy site called Kiss Library, which was shut down by the U.S. Court for the Western District of Washington. And over $7.8 million in statutory damages were awarded to 12 Authors Guild members, Amazon Publishing, and Penguin Random House for 52 acts of copyright infringement. And it was a huge victory, but not only for this particular court case, but it also puts the fear of God, as our president, Doug Preston, says, into other e-piracy sites that may be operating and knowing that justice will be served and there's somebody watching out over authors who hold these rights. So that's one example of the work that the Guild does for all writers and protecting America's literary heritage. So with us today to talk about their works are two authors that serve on the Authors Guild Council and or the Foundation Board. They are Roxana Robinson and Ralph Eubanks. Ralph goes by Ralph. And we are beyond lucky to have such a remarkable amount of genius on our boards and so many celebrated writers like these two. Roxana is the author of 10 books, 5 novels, including many of which explore the complex familial bonds and fault lines of family, such as Sparta, Cost, and of course the book we'll be speaking of tonight, Dawson's Fall. Roxana has also written 3 story collections and the biography, Georgia O'Keeffe, A Life. 4 of her books have been nominated for, were New York Times notable books, and her work appears widely, including in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Vogue, Harper's, and has been widely anthologized. She is a literary lion named by the New York Public Library and has received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, the MacDowell Colony, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She teaches in the Hunter College MFA program. Ralph is a Carl and Lily Pforzheimer. Did I pronounce that right? Pforzheimer, I think so. Foundation, yeah. Fellow at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute and a visiting professor at the University of Mississippi. He is the author of 3 books: The House at the End of the Road, the story of 3 generations of an interracial family in the American South, and Ever is a Long Time, a journey into Mississippi's dark past. His most recent book, which we'll discuss tonight, A Place Like Mississippi, a journey through a real and imagined literary landscape. Ralph is the former editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review at the University of Virginia and served as the director of publishing at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. from 1995 to 2013. He has contributed articles to the Washington Post Outlook, the Style sections, Wall Street Journal, Wired, New Yorker, National Public Radio, and is also a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and has been a fellow at the New America Foundation. Okay, so we're going to get started. Enough of me. Roxana was born in Kentucky, but grew up in Pennsylvania. Ralph grew up in Mount Olive, Mississippi. A Place Like Mississippi is Ralph's 3rd book that is set in or deals with themes of living in the South, this time through the lens of literary history. Dawson's Fall is Roxana's first novel to be set in the South, but it's about her family, ancestors, and their lives in South Carolina. So let's start with each of you just giving an overview of your book. So Roxana, why don't you start, and then we'll have Ralph go.
So everybody's family is complicated, right? You have your mother's side and you have your father's side, and they're the same or they're different, but you feel this very deep connection to them, and you think you know who you are, and you think you know who your family is. You grow up with certain stories that your family tells, and they're stories that may be very short, but they let you know how your family feels about education or the police or your Aunt Olive, who nobody likes, or, you know, whatever it is you learn as a child, you think is kind of rock bottom fact, and that's who you are in the world. And as you get older, you find out that some of those things are true, and you find out some of those things are not true. And it's complicated trying to figure out then where your place is in the world. So for me, I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I really was sort of based in New England, where my mother's family is from. And my father's family has really arrived in New England around 1700. So much of my family is from New England. And many of my family members were ministers and ministers' daughters and married ministers. Harriet Beecher Stowe is my great aunt. Her father was a minister. Her husband was a minister. My uncle was a minister. So my own feeling about my family was that we were from New England. We were ministers, and we were very clearly in the abolitionist camp. But my father's family, going back just one generation, my great-grandfather was an Englishman who came to this country to fight for the Confederacy. So that changes everything. It changes everything. But he came and fought in the Civil War. He had a good war. He became a captain in the cavalry. All of his friends were officers. He was a man of enormous courage and energy. He loved people. He loved meeting people. And by the end of the war, he had a zillion friends. He had no money. No one in the South had money, but he had enormous energy and decided he and a friend founded a newspaper. And so he remained the editor of that paper for the rest of his life. And in my family, we believed that he was kind of a hero because despite the fact he'd fought for the South, he was a liberal, and his views in the newspaper were liberal views. And so we held on to that. And it was a time when liberals were absolutely despised in the South. So I felt that he was kind of a hero, and you want to feel that your family is made up of heroes for one reason or another, whatever it is. If your family is, a criminal, you want them to be a really good criminal and to evade the police for their whole careers. So whatever they do, you want it to be good. And so I started, and he's a very dramatic, his story is very dramatic, and he's well known in Charleston. And I always thought that if I wrote about anybody, it would be about my mother's family, the Beechers. But somebody invited me down to Charleston to take part. Somebody was writing a book about this man, Dawson, and they asked me to come down to Charleston and be part of their book talk. And I was so curious and so interested that I went down there. And being Charleston, nothing has changed. The family house is there. The house of the doctor next door is there. His office is there. The courthouse is there. The trees are the same. It was like walking back 150 years into my family's history. And I became fascinated by him and the story. And of course, as I delved into it, as Ralph did when he delved into his own family story in his two wonderful memoir, sort of memoirs, what you learn is different from what you thought. And so that's a long explanation, but so I'm partly absolute New England and partly very deep Southern, have very deep Southern connections. So that's what I was exploring with this book.
Ralph, do you want to give us an overview of a place like Mississippi?
Sure. Well, I am a native Southerner. I often joke with people that I'm kind of a born again Southerner because I've come back to the South after being away for a very long time, using that usual Southerners trope about, I don't hate it. And so I returned to Mississippi in 2016, first to teach at Millsaps College. And that was kind of my real reconnection with Mississippi. And I was approached by an editor about writing a book on literary Mississippi. And the idea was that it was going to kind of follow this new literary trail that Mississippi was coming up. And this editor said to me, this is a book that I think needs to start in the Mississippi Delta. And I don't know why I react this way. I said, absolutely not. And I said, I can't tell you why, but I said, give me a while to kind of think about how this book should be structured. And I started thinking about, well, how should that work? I mean, this is a little state beside a mighty river that's produced a lot of writers. How do you tell that story? And I really started getting into the literature, and it was Natasha Trethewey's Theories of Time and Space that kind of gave me the direction about go straight down Highway 49 to where it ends at the Gulf, look out into the Gulf, and then kind of reconnect with yourself. And that's exactly what I did. And I said, this is where the story starts. So I journeyed up through the state and ended in the Mississippi Delta. So it's a story about the real and imagined, how the real becomes imagined, the imagined becomes real. And that's very true in Mississippi. And I think it's very much the way that Mississippi writers have created their work. But I would also say that it's a book about a search for home. And you don't search for home unless you're lost. And I think that I've been lost for a very long time, and kind of being connected back to Mississippi has made me feel this connection to home once again. Washington, D.C. is still very much my home, but I feel connected to both places. But as I also tell people, when you return to the place where you're from, there is this permanent sense of exile that you hold inside. And that makes you look at the place differently because of that sense of exile. And I think that's a part of the way that I work in writing about the South is I hold on to that sense of exile, even while I still feel as if I am back home. So.
I'm so glad you touched on the structure and the research, because I'll ask both of you, but oh my gosh, both of these books are so complex. Ralph, your book is broken into 7 chapters, each featuring a different geographic area. You must mention or cover over 4 dozen writers, poets, journalists, memoirists, novelists. There are photographers and artists in there. Your bibliography has 100 titles cited. Your research covered what Faulkner took for classes in his 3 semesters at Ole Miss. Like, this is very detailed. So please tell us, like, how did you research this very complicated, very in-depth beautiful. If it were a history, I would call it a historyography, like the history about the history. But this is like the book about many books. So how did you figure out what went in, what didn't go in? And
well, I really focused on writers who concentrated a great deal in Mississippi as a place. a few who didn't, but mostly that was the criteria. But I'd say the most important archival source I had was place. So yes, there are lots of these details that I can pull out of the Faulkner archive at the University of Virginia, or going through another writer's archive. But place was my primary archive. And the story I like to tell people a lot, and this is true. You stand in Eudora Welty's bedroom. You look out at Millsaps College. You think about her character, Virgie Rainey from Spring Piano Recital, and she said that story came about from hearing, the piano recital across the street. And it's like you begin to see how these things happen. You drive around Lafayette County. You drive to the crossing where the Bundrins crossed, and as I lay dying, and you can't help but feel that connection to place, because you're in the place that the writer also used as an archival source. Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably the most important thing. And I tell people I continue to do that. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts this year, but my apartment is not that far from the Anderson Memorial Bridge, which is the bridge Quentin Compson jumped to his death from. It's like, I got this connection to Mississippi right there in Cambridge. So I'm always thinking about how place keeps you connected. And I think that when you're working with place as an archive, you're also creating your own archive while you're using other archival sources.
And Roxana, your book has 3 writers' voices interwoven throughout it: your great-grandmother's diaries, actual articles from your great-grandfather's newspaper, and then, of course, your voice, the novelist's voice, which weaves these together, as one reviewer wrote, and propels the novel forward. So tell us how, well, first of all, how did you find this, your grandmother's diary, and how you decided to use these real documents versus fictionalizing these people and the events and the accounts in the novel?
So having written a big, fat, thick biography of a really well-known person, I was very tempted to make this into a straight biography, because these 2 characters have a place, and a small place, but a place in American history. And I could have perfectly legitimately just said, this is a biography, a double biography of these 2 characters. But I couldn't give up the 2 tools that a novelist depends on and cherishes, which are interior monologue and dialogue. And the biographer really can't ever use either one of those things with a straight face. So, and I couldn't give them up, because they add so much richness and so many layers to any kind of narrative. So I decided to call it a biographical novel, but everything in the book is true. Amazingly, there is a huge archive of my family at Duke at the Rubenstein Library. And in the 50s, I think, somebody approached my great uncle, their son, who had no children, and he gave or sold the whole archive to Duke. So everything is there, including the letters that Dawson wrote to his parents in London during the Civil War. How those letters got back to America after they died, I don't know, but there they are, these handwritten letters with numbers so that you can tell if one is missing. And he writes about what it's like at Gettysburg, what that battle was like, what it was like at Manassas, what it was like at Beaver Dam, how he learned to ride. He didn't come to this country as a cavalry officer. He didn't know how to ride until he joined the Army after the Navy failed. He decided he'd join the Army and learn to ride and become a cavalry officer. So everything is in his letters. And then, because he's a writer, he He also wrote his own reminiscences of it's called an officer's recollections or something like that. So that's his account too of the Civil War. And then he was the editor of this newspaper. So I had what he thought about every single thing for 25 years. I knew what he was thinking about the opera, what he was thinking about what was going on in Europe. He brought a European flavor to Charleston, South Carolina. He thought it should have international news. So he tells you what he thinks about the king and what the new books are. And he was an avid reader. So I had his thoughts on everything for 25 years. They were unsigned, but it was very clear who was writing them. And then Sarah was a wonderful diarist, and her book was, much of her diaries were published under the title, A Confederate Girl's Diary, I think it's called. And she wrote from Baton Rouge, and she recorded her family's experiences during the Civil War. So it was a very useful historical document. Not all of it was published. The rest of it is at LSU. I've read it there. And all the family letters, and the 19th century, people wrote letters all the time, and there were big families, and so all the letters are there. There's a huge archive at Duke. It's actually quite daunting. It's just hundreds of boxes of documents, and I think I read everything that was handwritten. There are a lot of things that were less appealing, but so I read everybody's personal thoughts, and we have these incredibly touching love letters from Dawson to Sarah. And when he first approached her, she had decided she was never going to marry. She was going to live with her mother and take care of her. She didn't want to get married. And Dawson actually was married at the time, although his wife was dying, which he knew. And she was never, we understand, she was never his real equal. Anyway, he fell in love with Sarah. And after his wife died, he asked her to marry him. And she said, absolutely not. And he asked permission to write to her. And she said, you may write to me, but I will only answer you after every 3 of your letters. After every 3 letters from you, you will get 1 letter from me. And he wrote these wonderful, touching, thoughtful, perceptive letters. And after 6 months, apparently that was the date she'd given him, he once again asked her to marry him. So I had their voices, and then her recounting of her father's death with the family gathered around and brushing his face to keep the flies away. And it's so intimate, their voices, and they were so touching that I first thought, well, I'm a novelist. I have to write all this in my own words. And then I thought it's actually that's hubris to say I can write their thoughts better than they did. They were both writers. And I thought it would be kind of honoring them to use their real words in these moments when they were, these intimate moments when they were writing about things that they really cared about. So I ended up sort of interleaving these different sources, the real ones from the newspaper. And when I was doing research, and Ralph, I know you had the same experience because it happens to all of us, but I thought I was looking for one thing, and then you find something else and you realize that that's what you were looking for. So when I started doing research, I thought that the only way I could get the archives from the newspaper, which is still extant, the Charleston News and Courier, it's called the Post and Courier today. And I had to get it on microfilm, those terrible big reels, and you wind them and you get seasick watching it. And Hunter was going through some kind of crisis, and I had to watch them in the basement of the library, and there was water on the floor, and the lights kept flickering. It was like it was like hell. And I just and I kept thinking I have to go over there, and I'd tell my husband I was going over to spend the evening in the basement at Hunter with the water around my ankles. And so I was scrolling through, I was looking for particular moments that were important, but as I was scrolling on these horrible microfilms, I would see these little squibs, 3 men killed with knives over argument over biscuit. And I would just keep scrolling. It's not what I was interested in, but there were so many of them. And finally I thought, it's Dawson who's putting these in. It's Dawson who's making a comment about the incredible, savage violence in South Carolina during this period. I had never seen anything like these accounts. And I finally later discovered that if I became a subscriber to the current Charleston Post and Courier, that gives you access to the entire archive going back to 1872 when it was founded.
Is it scanned?
Yeah.
Oh, so you
I
didn't have to sit in the basement? Oh, no.
It's another one of those things that you discover. Often you discover it too late. You find out that you didn't have to do that. But at least this way I did it. So I could sit in my pajamas and in the middle of the night, I could go to 1876 and find out what happened at Hamburg. And it was an incredible luxury to have this kind of ease of research, but also it allowed me then to focus on, and then I could follow Dawson, and they were fillers often. It was, they would take up 2 inches at the bottom of a column, and he'd put in this ghastly story about somebody who'd ambushed his best friend and shot him in the head because of something he'd said at a dance. And I mean, just incredible violence. And I realized it was Dawson who was nonviolent, who refused to carry a gun, who successfully banned dueling in South Carolina and tried to ban lynching. And he was unable to, he couldn't bear these stories of savagery. So he was putting them out there. He was bringing them on record. So I forget the question, but anyway, that was
well, let's segue.
Why we don't have to make things up in the South.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like I tell people, I don't have to make anything up. It's not
I think Roxana in her bibliography, it says, I have quoted this, and here are my primary sources. I haven't changed anything. The most preposterous things are true, or something. So both of your books obviously deal with the history of the South, both literary and historical events, which both deal with race when we're talking about the South. I'm going to read this quote that from Ralph's, I think it's either the first or second chapter, that the American idea of Blackness, not merely as a racialized category, but as a cultural, political, and economic identity, has its origins in the American South. And Ralph, discuss with us how the literature of the South illustrates, translates, and mirrors this American Blackness that you talk about in this chapter.
Well, I use that quote. It's from a piece I wrote about identity, about the way that identity is shaped, and that idea of Blackness. And so often I hear people who are from the North say, well, I really have no connection to the South, particularly Black people, and saying, yes, you do have a connection to the South. And when you start to say, like, where's your family from? Well, from New York, but where were they before that? They're in the South. So there's not only that attempt to really kind of connect Southern literature with Blackness, but also with this idea of Americanness, that we're thinking about the South not as a foreign country, but as a part of this country. And I think also for Black people, Black folks in this country, to begin to see this connection to the South and its literature. I think all too often we think that the fugitives did us a great disservice, because what they did through their whole philosophy, of agrarian philosophy, was they equated Southernness with whiteness. So for a very long time, Black folks felt that they had to deny their Southernness in order to claim their Blackness. And I think it's really important for us to embrace both of those, because that idea of Blackness comes out of the South. It comes out of being enslaved, out of those experiences of Jim Crow. And that's what sent people all around the country. And I wanted people to readers to connect with that, and also to connect with the literature of Mississippi, with writers like Richard Wright, like
Yeah.
Jesmyn Ward, with Natasha Trethewey, really kind of reclaiming the South. And I think that's something that it's in a time where Charles Blow is saying Black people move back to the South. Not only move back to the South, but kind of claim the South as a place that's central to this idea of Blackness.
And your earlier when you open, you talk about, if people go back to find something, it means something's lost. And how does that personally tie in with you and your identity? Because you talk about that in the previous two books, quite a bit. Yeah,
it really does. It really does tie in with my own identity. And I also, make it clear that that's a part of my identity, but it's not the only part of my identity. And I want people to see those multitudes, as well as the things that's really central to my identity, which is being Black and from the South. That's what really shaped me. And and it continues to affect the way that I look at the world, which I really came to realize being in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when all of a sudden, Roxana talks about her family, and there's statues to members of your family in Cambridge. It's like, I realized, oh my goodness, I'm the land of the abolitionists. I've left the Confederate statues behind, and I'm in this different place now. And I'd never really come to see it that way. And I began to feel like a Southerner in the Northeast, even though I've lived in the Northeast for 40 years. So it's a very, I guess it's looking at this through the lens of identity, which I do a great deal, but while I'm doing that, also trying not to look at it through a lens of exceptionalism.
That's so interesting. And of course, Roxana, talked about her family and what we want the outcome to be. But Dawson falls a set during the Reconstruction. And his views, as she said, like the rule of law, equality. But you have to deal a lot with race in that book, and how not only, your ancestors, but what was happening in South Carolina. And I think it was the New York Times review, Roxana, remind me if I have this wrong, that the reviewer says, how should a white writer write about whiteness? And then she answers her own question by saying, in no particular way. But I know you've thought a lot about this. So, and I've heard you, in various stages of the reception of the book and while you were writing the book, how should a white writer write about whiteness?
So it's a huge question. It was a huge question for me as I was writing the book, because I'm writing about my own family. So I have to challenge myself all the time. Am I trying to present them in a romanticized, idealized way? Probably I was. I had to keep checking myself and trying not to do that. Did I want them to be good guys? I certainly did want that. Were they completely good guys? They were not. They were not. So how do I write that fact? And how do I write about what was going on then? What tone do I use? Do I write it as though I'm a 19th century white person and I think this is all normal? I can't do that. And yet I also don't want to insert myself today into the book. So I have to find voices to use, a voice to use which can narrate some events which I find so odious, so appalling, so unacceptable to myself as a 21st century person. But I also have to have to set down the facts of what happened. And I also have to understand what was going on both sides of this issue. So the massacre at Hamburg was the time that was the most difficult for me to write about, because I had to set it down and I had to write it from both points of views. So, and there were times when my own rage comes out onto the page. And one of my nieces read the book and she said, "I have never seen you so angry. I've never seen your rage on the page before." And it's there. So that's one way a white person writes about whiteness, is going on record about what white people have done and being unable to contain herself about it. But I'm also trying to create a historical record. So I can't be as angry. I can't be so angry so that you won't trust me anymore as a narrator. So and also this is my family that I'm writing about. So it was very complicated and difficult for me to find the voice to use, but I have to use the same voice throughout as the narrator. One of the things that it forced me to do was to understand, to try to understand what it was like to be a white landowner before and after the Civil War, and the outrage those people felt. And they felt that something that was their biological right had been taken from them. And that sense of outrage was just echoing through every single thing they did. And I can imagine that. I think it's unacceptable. It's unconscionable, but I get why they couldn't give up this rage. It never stopped for them, because it was a sense of biological ownership that they had over themselves. So that went into these stories that I was telling, this sense of who they were on both sides of it. Anyway, it was unlike any other book I've ever written. Because of these things, and also because it's in another century. And so it's very hard. Hilary Mantel was my Bible during this book. I was trying to, because she used a sort of contemporary voice, and the dialogue was very contemporary. So you never felt that you had been caught up by the hoop skirts and the petticoats and the halberds. You felt as though you were living in something that minute. So I was trying to create dialogue and action that would make you feel that you were living through this, at the same time as letting you know how I felt about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I could sense your rage.
Yeah.
I really could. And that's one of the things that I found so compelling, was the way that you were having to navigate that. I even saw where you're kind of even inserting these views that are coming from the Dunning School about Reconstruction, and you've got Dawson kind of pushing against that whole idea there as well, which I found really interesting.
So let's broaden the talk. We're supposed to go to Q&A very soon, but this is Southern Writers and Writing. And I want you to talk about how both of your books fit into or address the themes and characteristics of Southern literature. And then, well, let's start there. Ralph, because you've done this massive atlas of Southern literature, explain what makes Southern literature. What are the characteristics and themes that keep coming up over and over again? And maybe even, like, if you would, like, why are these themes?
Well, I would say that, again, I am focusing on Mississippi literature. My family in Alabama would say, we have our own body of literature, and Georgians would have another one. But I think there are certain things about Southern place that are unique to the literature of the South. But I have to say, I was on a panel with the writer Michael Gora, who's a Faulkner scholar. And Michael said something really interesting. He said, it's time for us to begin to think about writers like Faulkner and Welty, not just as Southern writers, but as American writers, and seeing the Southern writing as part of this larger body of American literature. And we agree that what's unique about Southern writing is that it's still very much rooted in the South as a place, and about the relationship of the South to the rest of the country. And you can't necessarily say that about literature from Massachusetts, except in the 19th century. So it really,
Yeah.
that literature of New England, that's a uniquely New England perspective, really ends in the 19th century. But the South continued that, and I think has continued that. I think it's having a sense of tradition. And I think that's a big part of the literature of the South. And each one of these states would say that they have a very different literary tradition. I was given the keynote address for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. And there was someone said, why is he giving the keynote address for that? He's not a Georgian. So, well, he's a Southern writer, but sometimes we do get very parochial in the way that we think about it. And I think by thinking it, there are certain things that are unique to Southern place, but also thinking how the South fits in with the rest of the country as a body of American literature is really important. And that's one of the things that I was really trying to do. And it's what I try to do in most of my writing about the South, is how do we think about the South as both Southern, but also that archaic Mason-Dixon line, that archaic artificial Mason-Dixon line that separates the two places. Let's try to kind of erase those lines a little bit.
And Roxana, for Southern literature, like when you were writing Dawson's Fall and reading Sarah Morgan's diary, like, did you get a sense like, oh, this is Southern writing? Or did it just seem to you like this could have been Aunt Harriet Beecher's? Was there a different sense to you that this writing had a different source, a spring that was different?
That's a really interesting question. I should compare Sarah's writing to Aunt Hattie's and see how the styles are similar or different. Sarah was very well educated, as Dawson was, and so I didn't have a sense. There was no sort of local vernacular or anything like that. And her references were to English writers or very contemporary sort of literary current. But she certainly thought of herself as a Southerner. And at one point she talks about a Northern cousin. Some of the Morgans, her father's family, moved out to Western Pennsylvania, and she goes to visit one later after the Civil War. It's not in the published work. And she says, well, he's nice, but he's really a Yankee. Yeah. So it was very clear that she was a Southerner, and that was different. She does think of it as a different country. I think she went to New York. She went to New York once, and she let the hairdresser talk her into cutting off a whole foot of her hair. So it only came to her calf instead of to her ankles. But
oh my gosh. Okay, I am going to open it up, and my esteemed colleague, Nikki Maniscalco, is going to handle the Q&A. So I'm going to, and so for those of you, you can lift your hand, so that she can see you, or you could lift the little cartoon hand, or if you're being super shy, which we hope you're not, you could put it in the chat and she will read it for you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lynn. Laura, I see that you have asked the first question. If you want to unmute and ask.
Thanks. This is terrific, you guys. I'm just always hearing about Southern writers and Southern literature, and I love it all. And I hear about Western writers. There was always Wallace Stegner and Larry McMurtry. Is there a Northern writer or a Northern body of literature, or are we already in Canada? Or Northern Ireland?
Frances Fitzgerald writes about that in The Evangelists, and she says the South has no counterpart. It's the South and everything else. It's not the South and the North or the South and the West. It's the South and the rest of the country. I think the South I think, Ralph, you tell me what, I may be wrong. I think the South really does have a cultural identity that exists in the rest of the country, but it is regional. I mean, New England is different from the rest of the country, and the upper Midwest is, and the Pacific Northwest is. But the South is huge, and it has its own cultural history in a way that the rest of the country has in scattered segmental form. What do you think, Ralph?
I would agree with that, Roxana. There is, I wouldn't say there's the South and the rest of the country. I'm married to a Westerner, so I have to say this. I think there is a Western body of literature. What is really different now is that we don't really have what I would call a New England school of literature. I think we've got, in the Northeast, we've got Brooklyn and the rest of the country, the rest of the Northeast. I mean, that's really what we've got in the South is very unique in that way. But I have to say, in writing about the South, sometimes the person who really connects me to the place a lot is Joan Didion, who is associated with California. But the way she talks about California as a place is very different. But when Didion came to Mississippi in the 70s, and what she saw, she realized that she was totally out of her element. But that idea of place and being rooted somewhere, Didion has that. And that's something I really kind of, I tell people that every time I write an essay, I say, what would Didion do? It's like, because it's kind of like she invented this essay kind of rooted in place. And I just kind of tweak that and use it for the South. But yeah, the South is different, but I wouldn't say that we're the only place. I tend to shy away from exceptionalism, thinking about the regions of the country. So,
if I could just keep going for the washer dryer, Roxana, since you wrote that wonderful biography of Georgia O'Keeffe and the revision, which are my favorite book ever. Do you see a similarity with art when you go, oh, this is Southern art, these are Southern artists, or not as much as in literature?
That's a really good question. I think art was something that was centralized in New York. If you were an artist, you had to go to New York. And there certainly are regionalist artists, but not so many. And the sense was, if you were a great local artist, you had to go to New York and show your work there and be tested. So there were certainly artists who painted in the West, who painted in the Midwest, but everyone was sort of tested in the School of New York. So that now, as I say that, I'm thinking of artists who are from all over the country. So it's a huge question. I would have to.
Yeah, I know someone posted in the chat about outsider art, and I think that's a big part of the South. And I'm actually writing an essay for a catalog on the Do Good Fund, which is a great collection of Southern photography. And one of the things you realize in looking at images of the South is how much of the way of seeing is affected by past images of the South, people trying to connect that. Like someone saying, connecting William Christenberry, someone wrote about Christenberry there. But so how you connect with this tradition. I guess it is, in the South, there is a visual tradition as much as there is a literary tradition, I think.
But I think in the 19th century, I'm not thinking of, I can't think of a lot of great Southern artists. I think the artists came to New York and they went to the National Academy, and, Bierstadt went out and painted the Grand Canyon, and Thomas Moran painted Venice. So they went all over the place from there. But I can't think of an Albert Bierstadt from the South, and Georgia O'Keeffe was from Wisconsin and painted the Southwest. So it's going to be a different conversation about art.
Thanks. I'll give someone else a chance. This is terrific. Thank you.
Right. Anybody else have a question before I jump in with another one? You can raise your hand or type into the chat. I'd just like to hear from both of you of some of your favorite writers of your genre, and sort of anybody that we might have never heard of before that you kind of want to make sure that you signal boost.
Well, I really want people to read the work of Ellen Douglas. Mississippi writer from Greenville, Mississippi. I love her book, A Lifetime Burning. And I mean, really, my favorites are Richard Wright, a big fan of Natasha Trethewey's work. And yeah, I love Faulkner. And I think there are people who think that maybe Faulkner has run its course, and I said, no, there's still so much we can learn from Faulkner.
Thank you. Roxana, who do you have in your mind?
So wait, I was typing in at something. Is this, who are my favorite writers in the whole world, or right now, or Southern? What was it?
In this genre, in the Southern genre, and also anybody in that genre too that you think we may have not heard of before.
Ralph knows much more about Southern writing than I do. I'm going to say people that you have heard of. I love Eudora Welty. I love Flannery O'Connor. Richard Wright is a genius. Ellen Douglas, you're not the first person who's mentioned her as an undiscovered writer, and now I have to read her, but I never have. Who else? Well, those are my main favorites. O'Connor and Welty and Wright, I think, are the great heroes for me.
Thanks so much. All right, do we have any additional questions for you guys? If I want to just raise your hand, or you can type in the chat.
I have one.
Okay.
I didn't think I'd have time to ask it, but one of the things that we had a talk about time. We had one of these it was called Time Often on the Page. And Ralph, there's a quote in a Walker Percy novel, The Last Gentleman, that is, and he goes out west, the character, and he says something about the time, and the quote ends up being, every afternoon in Mississippi, it's always Wednesday afternoon, or maybe third. So explain what that, it's always Wednesday in Mississippi, or maybe Thursday. Did I get the quote right?
That's always Wednesday. In Mississippi, it's always Wednesday afternoon. And I think they said we're always, and when I read The Last Showman, I just reread The Last Showman as I was writing A Place Like Mississippi, I realized how true that was, is that it's the middle of the week. And, it's still that day before. I think for a long time on Thursdays, we continued with the tradition of closing at noon on Thursdays, which was the time to plant your victory guard, which is a holdover from World War II. That continued through the late 70s till I graduated from college. So it's always, we have this different sense of time, I think, in the South, particularly in Mississippi, where it's always Wednesday afternoon, it's always the middle of the week, and something good is coming up after that. So yeah, and being back in Mississippi, that's why someone said, well, what are you doing? I said, well, it's Wednesday afternoon. I said, but it's Thursday. So it's always Wednesday afternoon.
So much.
Okay.
Now, I believe you guys touched on this. Oh, we got somebody here. Tima, would you like to unmute and ask your question yourself? There she is. You're still muted right now.
Sorry, it's Tama Stoffer, and Ralph. I'm the photographer who reached out to you last spring. He was really interested in your book, and I've been working on a project called Southern Fiction, a photo project exploring the relationship between Southern places and Southern writers. So when I read his book, it was like very illuminating, this kind of scholarly interpretation, what I've been trying to do as an artist. But I was really interested tonight in what you're talking about in terms of encouraging Black people to reclaim their Blackness and their Southernness, but coming back to the South, and thinking of Jesmyn Ward, who's actually still living in her hometown, as far as I know, Delisle, Mississippi, at least part of the year. And I'm just curious if you have the opportunity to reach out to her and what level of involvement she had with your book. I know she's kind of notoriously elusive, and I've been really fascinated by her, and really, you know, some of her novels were, though I've been looking at 20th century writers, in terms of contemporary writers, I found her work to be the just searing and just incredible. And so I'm just wondering if you had any experiences you could share that about her relationship.
About Jesmyn Ward?
Yeah.
I mean, Jesmyn's is amazing. I got to interview Jesmyn in her hometown of DeLisle, Mississippi, and it was a very moving experience because I kept pushing Jesmyn on why doesn't she leave Mississippi? You know, this idea of leaving and kind of leaving to find something. And we were standing out, and she said, "Feel that warm breeze." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Feel that eggy smell." I said, that all feels like home. That warm breeze feels like an embrace. I just can't leave that. And I actually stood there with my mouth open, and the photographer was there shooting this, and he says, "You need to write that down," because that's just kind of how it really hit me. And I think that's one of the things that Jesmyn does, is she's very connected to the place. And another writer who's very connected to it is Casey Lehman. I think he, you know, talks about writing under central Mississippi skies. And I noticed that Deirdre Payne from Jackson, Mississippi kind of put something in the chat. And I know Deirdre noted that she is from central Mississippi. So what Casey has done is got us to think about central Mississippi as kind of being different from the rest of Mississippi, because the way that he writes about it and the way that he describes it. But it's Jesmyn's incredible connection with the Gulf Coast. Jesmyn and Natasha Trethewey's connection with the Gulf Coast that I think really made a big difference in writing this book. And really, it's why it starts on the Gulf Coast.
Thank you.
Right. Check all these little squares. Well, one thing I think as a last question before we wrap up, Roxana, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the challenges of sort of diving back into your own family history, knowing that you're going to find some things that are unsavory, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is very troubling for white people with ancestors in the South pre-Civil War is everyone was complicit in this scheme, everyone. So you're not going to find, I mean, there were very few abolitionists in the South. So you're not going to find that your family happened to be the only white family in the whole South that was against slavery. They weren't. Everyone was in it. And there were about 5 million people in the South before the Civil War, and they were all part of that system. But they all were not devils. I mean, statistically, it's very unlikely that every single one of those white people was a devil. So there were people who counted themselves decent and honorable, and they loved their families, and they were good to the community. So how did that happen? And I had to figure out a way to confront the fact that my family, my great-grandmother, came from Louisiana, and that's what the system was in Louisiana and Baton Rouge. And she was a decent person. So how could it be? And I was not the only person to find myself in this quandary. How is it possible that somebody who was kind and honorable and generous was part of a system that is a crime against humanity? And one of the things that I came to understand was that religion played a huge part in it. And so that because the foundation of slavery rests on economics. It's an economic system that favors whoever's got the upper hand. So that will always be what drives it. But what made people accept it was religion. And so in the South in the 19th century, everybody went to church. You had your own pew, you all showed up, everybody saw what you were wearing, and if you were late. And the minister, you listened to the minister, and the ministers preached the fact that this was God's choice. He created two races. You could tell which one was superior. and everybody bought into it. So it's incredibly disheartening to realize that this was a system that was taught and that was not rejected. And it's one reason there's so much the white fragility that we've read about. The white people don't want to think about it. They don't want to believe that they were part of it. They don't think that their family was part of it. It's very painful to come to terms with it. So for me, and it may not be useful to anybody else to find out what I thought about, what I came to terms with in learning about my family, but it was very useful for me to have to confront the fact of our national history. And I thought that when I started writing this book, I thought I was writing about the history of my family, and I came to understand that I was writing about the history of my country.
That is a great place to leave. And while we're on this exact topic, I do want to point out, if you haven't noticed in the chat, that Eubanks is on here, and she too has written a book called Confederates in My Closet. Actually, is it a blog, Anne? Could you, and which reckons with her ancestors on the wrong side of things.
It's a website, and actually, yes, I do deal with many Confederate ancestors, and the most recent piece is about the one abolitionist in the family who I found something fairly discreditable about, to my surprise and dismay. It's the last piece on the website. He nominated Lincoln in the 1860 convention, and then he became a judge, and it was pretty fascinating, but it didn't turn out exactly the way I had expected and hoped in writing about him.
We'll have to read your blog. But thank you all for coming. We try to keep these to exactly an hour so that we can all break and go be with our families and have our dinner. But upcoming next is Ronan Farrow and Gia Tolentino on Monday, the 7th of February, talking about the lives of women, Ronan's big break on the Me Too movement, and Gia Trick Mirror, and they talk together about the Harvey Weinstein case and Britney Spears conservatorship. On March 7th, Gish Jen, whose collection of stories, Thank You, Mr. Nixon, comes out very early February. She'll be speaking on writing the immigration experience. And Janet Deward Bell, the widow of Derek Bell, who is called the father of critical race theory, will speak with Dr. Kendall Thomas on her new book of essays from the Derek Bell lectures on law and criminal race theory, which was published late last year. Kendall Thomas is a scholar at Columbia Law of Comparative Constitutional Law and Human Rights. So lots coming up, and I want to thank our wonderful speakers. It was wonderful to talk with you, and thank you so much for doing this.